For 22 years, one of Korea's most powerful men lived a double life. To his children, he was a ruthless boss and an untouchable father who answered to no one. But behind locked doors and sealed envelopes, he was carrying a secret so explosive it could topple an empire, a wife. A Black American woman he married in secret, loved in silence, and protected with his own reputation. When his heart finally gives out on the boardroom floor, his children rush to claim what they believe is rightfully theirs. But they never expected the hospital doors to open and a stranger to walk in and say 4 words that shatter everything. "I'm here to see my husband." What happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and legacy. Stay to the very end. This story will break your heart and heal it in the same breath. Like, comment, and subscribe before we begin, because you will want to relive this one. The conference hall in Singapore was still buzzing when Cha Myung-soo first saw her. It was raining outside, the kind of warm tropical rain that turned the windows silver, and inside the Marina Bay Convention Center, 300 delegates from 40 countries were packing up their notebooks after a session on disaster relief funding. Myung-soo had not wanted to attend. His assistant had begged him for 2 weeks to make an appearance, if only for the photograph. Cha Group's name stamped on a humanitarian initiative meant good press, and good press meant nothing to a man who had spent the last decade quietly outrunning his family's old reputation. He was 43 years old that year. Successful. Respected. Lonely in a way he had stopped admitting to himself. He was gathering his coat when he heard her voice across the room, sharp and clear, cutting through the polite murmur of departing delegates. "With respect, sir, a scholarship isn't charity. It's an investment. If you fund a child's education for 4 years and then abandon them at the finish line, you haven't helped them. You've just delayed their fall." She was speaking to a delegate twice her age, a stiff-shouldered man from a European foundation who looked mildly offended to be corrected by a woman half his height. Myung-soo found himself stopping in the aisle, coat half over one arm, to listen. The woman was maybe 40, dressed simply in a navy blazer, her natural hair pulled back from a face that carried both warmth and unmistakable authority. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. When she finished speaking, the European delegate nodded slowly, chastened, and excused himself. She turned, caught Myung-soo watching, and instead of looking away, smiled. "You agree with me," she said. It wasn't a question. "I do," Myung-soo admitted, surprised at how easily the words came. "Though I suspect you didn't need my agreement to win that argument." "No," she said, extending her hand. "But it's nice to have it anyway." Sonia Jaden. Cha Myung-soo. Her handshake was firm. Her eyes held his a half-second longer than politeness required, as if she were deciding something about him in that moment and had already made up her mind. That night, at the welcome dinner, they were seated 4 chairs apart and somehow ended up talking for 2 hours anyway, leaning across the empty seats between them while the rest of the table drifted into its own conversations. She told him about the foundation she ran in Atlanta, one that placed doctors and teachers in countries recovering from conflict. He told her, carefully, in the vague language he'd perfected over 20 years, that his family was in business, manufacturing, logistics, a bit of everything. He did not mention the years before that, the years his family did not speak of, the years that had taught him how to keep his face still no matter what was happening beneath it. Sonia noticed the vagueness. She noticed most things. But she didn't push. "You have sad eyes for a rich man," she said instead, halfway through dessert, studying him over the rim of her water glass. Myung-soo nearly choked on his wine. No one had spoken to him that plainly in 15 years. His children didn't. His board didn't. His sister certainly didn't. Mo Junja spoke to him the way a general spoke to a soldier, all instruction and expectation. "And you have brave ones," he said finally, for a woman having dinner with a stranger. "I've never been afraid of the truth," Sonia said. "Only of people who hide from it." He didn't sleep that night. He lay in his hotel room replaying the conversation, turning her words over like stones in his palm. He was a man who had built walls so tall and so thick that even his own children could not see over them, and in one dinner, this woman had walked straight through a door he hadn't known was still unlocked. The conference ran 3 more days. He found reasons to attend every session she was in. She began saving him a seat without being asked. On the second night, they walked along the Marina Bay waterfront long after the other delegates had gone to bed, the city's skyline throwing colored light across the water, and she asked him, without any judgment in her voice, why a man so obviously carrying weight refused to set any of it down. "Some weight is not mine to set down," he said. "It belongs to people who came before me. My father. My grandfather. I only carry it forward." "That sounds lonely." "It is. You could put it down anyway," she said quietly. "Just for a moment. I won't tell anyone." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Cha Myung-soo laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that came from somewhere he had locked away years ago. By the final night of the conference, they both understood something had shifted, something neither of them had been looking for and neither of them wanted to walk away from. Sonia was 52 now, 22 years later, sitting in a hospital chair beside the man that stranger had become, but on that rainy night in Singapore, she was 30, ambitious, unattached, and utterly unprepared for how quickly this quiet, careful man would take root in her heart. "I have to go back to Seoul tomorrow," Myung-soo told her, standing at the elevator, unable to make himself press the button. "I have to go back to Atlanta," she said. "That's very far from Seoul." "It is," she agreed. And then, softer, "Doesn't have to stay that way." He kissed her before he could think better of it, there in the hotel corridor with the elevator chiming uselessly beside them, and when he pulled back, she was smiling the way she'd smiled at him across the conference room 3 days earlier, like she'd already known exactly how this would end. It would take another year of transcontinental flights, secret weekends in cities chosen for their anonymity, and long phone calls at hours that made no sense in either time zone before Myung-soo worked up the courage to ask her to marry him. It would take 22 more years, a hidden wedding ring on a chain around her neck, sealed letters in a lawyer's safe, and a heart attack on a boardroom floor before the rest of the world would learn her name. But it started there. Singapore. The rain. A woman who wasn't afraid of the truth, meeting a man who had spent his whole life running from it. 22 years later, on a Tuesday morning in Seoul, Cha Myung-soo collapsed in the middle of a board meeting. He had been mid-sentence, reviewing third-quarter projections with the calm authority his executives had come to expect, when he suddenly stopped talking. His hand went to his chest. The papers slid from his fingers onto the polished table. Yeonmak, seated 2 chairs down, thought for one confused second that his father was choking on water. Then Myung-soo's body tipped sideways out of the chair and the room exploded into chaos. "Call an ambulance." "Now. Someone get Dr. Han on the phone. He's on the medical advisory board." "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" Yeonmak was on his knees on the boardroom carpet before he realized he had moved, his father's head cradled against his suit jacket, his fingers pressed clumsily against the side of Myung-soo's neck searching for a pulse he didn't know how to find. Myung-soo's lips had gone the color of ash. His breathing was shallow, rattling, wrong. Dad, look at me. Stay with me." The ambulance took 11 minutes to arrive, though it felt to Yeonmak like 11 years. By the time the paramedics burst through the boardroom doors with a gurney, Myung-soo had stopped responding entirely, his eyes rolled back, his chest rising in thin, uneven pulls. "Massive cardiac event," one paramedic said to the other, voice clipped and fast. "We need to move." Yeonmak rode in the ambulance, gripping the metal rail beside his father's gurney so hard his knuckles went white, watching the paramedics work with the detached efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times and knew better than to promise anything. He called his sister first. "Siriang, it's Dad. It's bad. Meet us at Seoul National Hospital." Then his brother. "Mujin, drop whatever you're doing. Now." By the time the ambulance doors opened at the emergency entrance, Siriang was already there, having abandoned a client meeting mid-sentence, her heels clicking frantically across the pavement as she ran alongside the gurney being wheeled inside. Mujin arrived 11 minutes later, out of breath, his tie loosened and askew, looking like a man who had run the last 3 blocks on foot because traffic had been too slow for his patience. "What happened? What did the doctors say?" "Nothing yet. They just took him back." The three siblings stood together in the sterile brightness of the hospital corridor, close in proximity, but strangely distant in every other way, the way people are when a crisis has stripped away all the small talk that usually cushions their interactions. Emo Jumja arrived 20 minutes after that, moving through the hospital doors with the same commanding presence she brought to every room she entered, her cane striking the tile floor like punctuation. "Where is he?" she demanded. "What are they doing to my brother?" "They haven't told us anything," Yeonmak said. "Dr. Han is with him now." Dr. Han Sungrok emerged 40 minutes later, his surgical mask pulled down around his neck, his expression carefully arranged into the practiced neutrality of a man about to deliver news no family wanted to hear. "Mr. Cha has suffered a massive myocardial infarction," he said. "We've stabilized him for now, but there's significant damage to the heart muscle. The next 24 hours are critical. I won't lie to you, the outlook is uncertain." "Uncertain how?" Yeonmak pressed. "Give me a percentage. A number. Something." "Yeonmak," Siriong murmured, a warning in her voice, but her brother ignored her. Dr. Han's joy tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't traffic in percentages, Mr. Cha. I can tell you that your father is a fighter, and that we are doing everything medically possible. Beyond that, I would ask you to prepare yourselves for either outcome." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, the ripples spreading through all four of them in different ways. Emo Jumja sat down heavily in a plastic waiting room chair, her cane clattering against the floor, her composure cracking for the first time in longer than any of them could remember. Mujin turned away and pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. Siriong simply stood very still, staring at the closed doors behind which her father lay fighting for his life, her arms wrapped around herself as though she might otherwise come apart. Yeonmak was the first to speak again, and when he did, his voice had already begun to shift, grief-curdling, almost imperceptibly, into calculation. "We need to call Attorney Pyo," he said. "If something happens to Dad, we need to know exactly where things stand. The company can't afford instability. The board will be watching every move we make." "He's not dead," Yeonmak, Siriong snapped, rounding on him. "Can you not, for once, think about anything other than the company?" "I'm thinking about protecting what he built," Yeonmak shot back. "Someone has to. You think Grief pays severance packages? You think Grief keeps 8,000 employees on payroll if this company falls into chaos? He's our father," Mujin said quietly, his voice cracking. "Not a line item." Yeonmak opened his mouth to respond and then closed it again, some flicker of shame passing briefly across his face before the mask of control settled back into place. He pulled out his phone and stepped toward the window, already dialing, already retreating into the version of himself that knew how to survive a crisis by controlling it. Emo Jumja watched her nephew with something like approval and something like sorrow, both emotions sitting uneasily together on her weathered face. "He's right to think of the company," she said quietly to no one in particular. "Your father would want that. Weakness invites vultures." "Aunt Jumja, please," Siriong said, exhausted. "Not now." They settled into the long, terrible rhythm of hospital waiting, the vinyl chairs, the vending machine coffee no one really wanted, the murmured updates from passing nurses that gave no real information. Hours crawled by. Myung-soo was moved to the ICU. The family took turns standing at the small window in the door, watching the machines that now kept their father tethered to life, each of them privately terrified and unwilling to say so aloud. It was well past midnight when the automatic doors at the far end of the corridor slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. A woman walked through them. She was in her 50s, tall, with the kind of composed grace that seemed unbothered by the late hour or the fact that she had clearly traveled a great distance to be there. She wore a simple charcoal coat and carried nothing but a small overnight bag slung over one shoulder. Her dark eyes moved across the waiting room with quiet purpose until they settled on the nurse's station. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm, carrying easily down the corridor. "I'm here to see my husband. Cha Myung-soo." The words dropped into the waiting room like a stone into still water. Yeonmak looked up first, his brow furrowing in confusion. Siriong's head turned slowly, disbelief already forming on her face. Mujin simply stared, mouth slightly open. Emo Jumja rose halfway out of her chair, her cane forgotten on the floor beside her. I'm sorry, the nurse at the station said, glancing uncertainly toward the family gathered nearby. Are you a relative? I'm his wife, the woman said again, evenly, as though she had said it 1,000 times before and expected, this time, to finally be believed. Sonia Jaden. I need to see him. The waiting room went completely, utterly silent. Yeonmak was the first to move. He crossed the waiting room in 6 long strides and planted himself between Sonia and the nurse's station, his shoulders squared, his voice low and hard. I don't know who you are or what you're trying to pull, but my father does not have a wife. My mother passed away 16 years ago, and he never remarried. Whoever told you this is his room, they were mistaken. I understand this is a shock, Sonia said, her voice remaining level despite the hostility rolling off him in waves. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because my husband is dying and I need to see him. Security, Yeonmak called toward the nurse's station, not taking his eyes off her. This woman needs to be escorted out. Yeonmak. Seryong stepped forward, something uncertain flickering across her face. Wait. Let's hear her out. Hear her out. Yeonmak turned on his sister incredulously. She walks in here in the middle of the night claiming to be Dad's wife, and you want to hear her out? Do you have any idea what kind of people try this? Con artists smell money the moment a man like Dad ends up in a hospital bed. Sonia's expression did not change, though something in her eyes sharpened. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small leather folio, opening it calmly and holding it out, not to Yeonmak, but to the nurse behind the station. My identification. My passport. And this. She produced a folded document, its creases worn soft from years of careful handling. A certified copy of our marriage certificate. I understand you have no reason to trust a stranger's word. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to look at the paper. 2 hospital security guards had arrived by now, drawn by the rising tension, and one of them reached for the documents with visible uncertainty, glancing between Sonia's calm face and Yeonmak's furious one. This is insane, Yeonmak said. Anyone can forge a document. Then have it verified, Sonia replied, unbothered. I have nowhere else to be tonight except beside my husband's bed. I can wait as long as it takes. It was in that moment, as the security guard turned the marriage certificate over in his hands and the family stood locked in a standoff none of them fully understood, that the elevator doors at the end of the hall opened and a tall, silver-haired man stepped out, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who had clearly been summoned and had come as quickly as he could. Let her through, the man said, his voice carrying easily down the corridor. Every head turned. Professor Kai Mo Jumja said, startled. What are you doing here? Kai Do-hyun crossed the waiting room without slowing, his eyes moving briefly over the family before settling, with unmistakable warmth, on Sonia. Sonia, he said quietly. I came as fast as I could. Do-hyun. Sonia's composure cracked for just a moment, relief and grief mixing plainly on her face as she reached out and gripped his forearm. How is he? I don't know yet. I just arrived. Kai turned to the security guards, his expression hardening into something that brooked no argument. This woman is Mrs. Cha Myong-soo. She has every right to see her husband. Let her through immediately. Professor Kai, with respect, Yeonmak said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. You can't just walk in here and vouch for a stranger. Who exactly is she to you? How do you even know her? Kai turned to look at Yeonmak directly, and something in his expression, old sorrow, old guilt, the weight of a secret carried far too long, silenced the younger man before he could say anything further. I have known Sonia Jaden for 22 years, Kai said quietly. I was a witness at her wedding. To your father. The words hung in the air like smoke that would not clear. That's not possible, Seryong whispered. It's true, Kai said. I'm sorry none of you ever knew. That was never meant to be my secret to keep for this long, but it was your father's choice, and I honored it. I won't honor it any further, not tonight, not while he's fighting for his life. Sonia has every right to be here. Please, let her see him. The security guard, documents still in hand, glanced uncertainly at the hospital's chief administrator, who had been summoned in the commotion. A brief, tense conversation followed near the nurse's station, voices dropped low, until finally the administrator nodded. The documentation appears to be in order, he said. Mrs. Cha may see her husband. Yeonmak's fists clenched at his sides. Seryong pressed a hand over her mouth. Mujin simply stared at the woman standing calmly amid the wreckage of everything they thought they knew about their father, his expression somewhere between shock and something that almost looked like curiosity. "This isn't over," Yeonmak said to Sonia, his voice low and dangerous. "Whatever you're playing at, we will find out the truth." "I hope you do," Sonia said gently, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I've been waiting 22 years for your father to tell you himself. I never wanted it to happen like this. But I promise you, Yeonmak, I am not your enemy." She said his name like she already knew it, like she had known it for a very long time. Yeonmak said nothing. He simply watched, jaw tight, as a nurse led Sonia down the corridor toward the ICU, Kai Do-hyun walking silently at her side. The ICU was hushed and dim, lit mostly by the soft glow of monitors tracking Myung-soo's vital signs in careful green lines. He lay motionless beneath a tangle of tubes and wires, his face slack, his chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance. He had been unconscious for 3 days. Sonia stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the sight of him, the man she had built a secret, sprawling life around for over 2 decades, now reduced to something so fragile it made her chest ache. "Oh, Myung-soo," she whispered. She crossed the room slowly and settled into the chair beside his bed, setting her overnight bag down without looking at it, her eyes fixed entirely on his still face. She reached out and took his hand, careful of the 4-line taped to the back of it, and pressed it gently between both of hers. "I'm here," she said softly, leaning close enough that her voice would reach him even if nothing else could. "I know you're tired. I know you've been carrying this for so long. But I'm here now, and you don't have to carry it alone anymore. Do you hear me? You are not alone." The monitors beeped their steady, indifferent rhythm. Nothing changed. "You stubborn, impossible man," she continued, her voice thick with tears she refused to let fall. 22 years, and you still won't make anything easy, will you? Not even this." She laughed, a small broken sound. "I love you. I have loved you since a rainy night in Singapore when you looked at me like I was the only person in the room who could see you clearly. I still see you clearly, Myung-soo. Now come back. Come back so I can tell you in person." For a long moment, nothing happened. And then, so slight that Sonia almost thought she had imagined it, his fingers moved. Just barely. A twitch against her palm. "Myung-soo." She sat forward instantly, her heart hammering. "Myung-soo, can you hear me?" The monitor beside the bed let out a different sound, not an alarm, but a shift in rhythm, the erratic peaks smoothing gradually into something steadier, stronger. A nurse who had been watching from the doorway rushed forward, checking the readouts with wide eyes. "His heart rate is stabilizing," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. "It's actually stabilizing." Kai Do-hyun, standing just behind Sonia, felt his own eyes burn. "Sonia," he murmured. "I'm here," Sonia said again, louder now, urgent, gripping Myung-soo's hand tighter. "I'm right here. Come back to me." Myung-soo's eyelids fluttered. Once, twice, and then, slowly, impossibly, they opened. His gaze was unfocused at first, drifting across the ceiling before finding its way, with visible effort, to the woman leaning over him. "Sonia," he rasped, his voice barely more than breath. "Yes." She was crying now, openly, pressing his hand against her cheek. "Yes, it's me. I'm here." Dr. Han Sungrok arrived within minutes, alerted by the nurse's urgent call, and stood in stunned silence at the foot of the bed, studying the monitors with the particular disbelief of a man who had genuinely not expected this outcome. "This is..." He shook his head slowly. "In 30 years of practice, I've rarely seen a recovery like this." He was unresponsive for 3 days. His vitals were declining, not improving. Whatever just happened here, he looked at Sonia with something like professional awe. "It made a difference." "He knew I was here," Sonia said simply, still holding Myung-soo's hand as though she might never let go again. That's all it was. He knew. Outside the ICU, through the small reinforced window in the door, 3 siblings and an aunt stood watching in stunned, uncomprehending silence as the monitors that had tracked their father's decline for 3 long days finally, impossibly, began to climb back toward life. Guided, it seemed, by nothing more than the hand of a stranger none of them had ever known existed. Who is she? Mujin whispered, almost to himself. Who is this woman? No one answered. No one could. By morning, Myung-soo had been moved out of critical condition, though he remained weak, drifting in and out of sleep, his voice still faint whenever he woke. The family gathered in a private consultation room down the hall, ostensibly to discuss his care, though the real subject hanging over the table was the woman now sitting quietly at his bedside. I want answers, Yeonmak said, pacing the length of the small room. Real ones. Not vague gestures at some marriage certificate that could have been forged by anyone with a printer and enough nerve. Professor Kai vouched for her, Seryong said, though her voice carried more uncertainty than conviction. He said he was a witness at their wedding. Professor Kai is Dad's oldest friend. Of course he'd cover for him. Yeonmak stopped pacing and turned to face the room. I'm not saying he's lying. I'm saying none of this makes sense. Dad has never once mentioned another wife. Not in 22 years. Not to any of us. You don't just forget to mention a marriage for 2 decades unless there's something being hidden. Clearly there is something being hidden, Emo Jumja said dryly from her seat near the window, her cane resting across her lap. The question is what, and why, and what it means for this family. It means, Yeonmak said, that some woman is about to walk in here and try to claim half of everything Dad built. Yeonmak. Mujin's voice was quiet but firm. Drawing surprised looks from his older siblings, Mujin rarely contradicted him directly. Did you see what happened in there last night? Dad had been unconscious for 3 days. The doctors had basically given up hope. And then she walked in, held his hand, and he woke up. That's not the behavior of a con artist. That's not something you can fake. Coincidence, Yeonmak said, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Was it? Mujin pressed. Because it looked like something else to me. Before Yeonmak could respond, the door opened and Sonia stepped inside, her expression composed but tired, dark circles shadowing her eyes from the sleepless night. She had clearly heard at least part of the conversation through the door, and she did not pretend otherwise. I'll answer whatever questions you have, she said quietly, closing the door behind her. I understand this must feel like an ambush. It wasn't meant to be. I would have given anything for your father to have told you himself in his own time, in his own way. But he's not able to right now, and I won't keep hiding simply because the truth is inconvenient. Yeonmak crossed his arms. Then start with the ring. Sonia's hand went instinctively to her collarbone, where a thin gold chain disappeared beneath the collar of her blouse. Slowly, deliberately, she drew it out. A wedding band hung from the chain, simple and unadorned, the gold slightly worn from years against her skin. Your father wears its match, she said. He has for 22 years. I imagine you've seen it on his hand 1,000 times and never once wondered why a man who claimed never to have remarried still wore a wedding ring. Silence fell over the room. Yeonmak's jaw tightened, some private memory clearly surfacing, a flash, perhaps, of his father's hand resting on a boardroom table, gold catching the light, a detail so ordinary he had never thought to question it. That doesn't prove anything, he said, though the fight had gone out of his voice. No, Sonia agreed. But it's a start. Emo Jumja rose slowly from her chair, leaning on her cane, and crossed the room to stand directly in front of Sonia, studying her with a sharp, assessing gaze she had once used to evaluate business partners and rivals alike. You expect us to simply accept this, she said. That my brother married a foreign woman in secret and hid it from his own children, his own sister, for over 2 decades. You understand how that sounds. I understand exactly how it sounds, Sonia said, holding the older woman's gaze without flinching. It sounds like a lie. I know that. I've had 22 years to imagine this exact conversation, and in every version, I understood how impossible it would sound. But I'm asking you to remember something, Mrs. Emo. Your brother is a careful man. A private man. He didn't hide me because there was nothing between us. He hid me because there was everything between us, and he was terrified of what it might cost the people he loved most. Or, Emo Jumja said, he hid you because he knew this family would never have accepted it, and you knew that too, and you were both content to take what you wanted in the shadows while his children grew up not knowing their own father. The words landed with deliberate cruelty, and for the first time, something flickered across Sonia's composed face, not anger, but old, deep hurt. You're not wrong that it costs something, she said quietly. It cost me 22 years of never being introduced to my husband's children. It cost me birthdays I watched from photographs he brought me. It cost me standing beside him at events I wasn't allowed to attend. Do you think I don't understand what was taken from all of us? I have grieved this arrangement every single year we lived inside it. But I never once regretted marrying him because I understood what he was protecting and I loved him enough to let him protect it. How noble, Emo Jumja said coldly. A woman willing to sacrifice everything for money she'll eventually collect anyway. Aunt Jumja, Mujin said, startled by the venom in her voice. Sonia did not raise her voice, though something steadier and harder settled into it. I have run a humanitarian foundation for 30 years, Mrs. Emo. I have built hospitals, funded scholarships, and buried friends who died doing work far more dangerous than sitting in boardrooms. I did not marry your brother for his money. I have my own. I married him because when I was in a hotel corridor in Singapore 23 years ago, he looked at me like the first honest thing he'd seen in years, and I felt the exact same way about him. If you want to believe otherwise, I can't stop you. But I won't apologize for loving your brother, and I won't leave his side while he's fighting for his life, regardless of how uncomfortable my presence makes any of you. She turned and walked out of the room before anyone could respond, the door clicking softly shut behind her. For a long moment, no one spoke. She's not what I expected, Mujin said finally, quietly, almost to himself. She's dangerous, Yeonmak said, though the conviction in his voice had visibly thinned. Composed people always are. Seryong said nothing at all. She was staring at the closed door, her arms wrapped around herself, an old, unnamed ache stirring in her chest that she didn't yet have words for, something that felt, unaccountably. Like the first fracture in a foundation she had spent her whole life standing on without question. The truth, when it finally surfaced in full, came slowly and in pieces, first through Kai Do-hyun's careful, reluctant account, and later through the letters and photographs that attorney Pyo would eventually bring to light. But the story itself began not long after that rainy conference in Singapore, when a long-distance courtship that neither of them had planned for became something neither of them could walk away from. They had married quietly in the United States 2 years after they met, in a small courthouse in Georgia, with only Kai Do-hyun and a justice of the peace as witnesses. Sonia wore a cream-colored dress with no veil. Myung-soo wore a plain gray suit instead of anything that might have drawn attention. There was no reception, no photographer beyond a single disposable camera Kai had insisted on bringing, no family present on either side. Sonia's own parents had passed years earlier, and her siblings lived scattered across the country. Informed only after the fact, with careful explanations about privacy and international business complications that none of them fully questioned. I feel like I'm stealing you, Myung-soo had told her the night before the wedding, sitting on the edge of a hotel bed in Atlanta, his tie already loosened, his expression heavy with something between joy and guilt. You deserve a wedding with 500 guests and your name in the newspaper. Instead, I'm giving you a courthouse and a secret. I don't want 500 guests, Sonia had said, taking his hands in hers. I want you. However that has to look. It has to look like nothing for now, he said quietly. My family, Myung-soo, if certain people ever learn you exist, it will not simply be inconvenient. There are old debts in my family's history. Old enemies who would use any weakness, any scandal, to move against us. My children are still young. My company is still finding its footing after years of trying to distance itself from what my father built it on top of. If this comes out wrong, at the wrong time, it could cost them everything I've spent my whole life trying to build for them. I understand, Sonia said, and she meant it. She had grown up watching her own mother navigate careful silences for the sake of protecting a fragile peace, and she recognized the particular exhaustion in Myung-soo's voice. The weight of a man perpetually calculating the cost of his own happiness against the safety of everyone he loved. It won't be forever, he promised her. When the time is right, when the company is stable, when my children are old enough to understand, I will tell them everything. I will stand beside you in front of the whole world and I will not be ashamed. And until then? Until then, he said, lifting her hand to his lips, I will love you in every way circumstances allow, and I will find you in every city I can reach, and I will carry you with me even when I cannot carry you beside me. It was a promise he had, in his own imperfect way, tried to keep for 22 years. He flew to Atlanta whenever business could plausibly explain his absence, a supplier meeting in Charlotte that somehow always required an extra 2 days, a logistics conference in Miami with a mysteriously flexible itinerary. Sonia, for her part, built her life around a marriage that existed mostly in stolen weekends and long phone calls placed at odd hours to avoid time zone conflicts. She never asked him to choose between her and his children. She never once suggested he abandon the family he had built before he met her. You have 3 children who need their father, she told him once, early in their marriage, when he had confessed, in a rare, unguarded moment, how much he hated leaving her at airport gates, how much he wished he could simply stay. I refuse to be the reason they lose you, even partially. Go home, Myung-soo. Be their father completely. I will still be here. It was Sonia, in fact, who insisted he never miss a birthday, never miss a school event, never let the secret of their marriage become an excuse for absence in his children's lives. When Moojin turned 12 and desperately wanted a telescope he'd seen in a magazine, it was Sonia who found the exact model in an American specialty shop and mailed it to Myung-soo's private post office box so he could wrap it and give it to his son as though he'd found it himself. When Seryong graduated from university with honors, it was Sonia who suggested the particular pen, a vintage fountain pen, elegant and understated, that Myung-soo presented to his daughter with a pride Seryong had cherished for years without ever knowing where the gift idea had truly come from. You're helping me raise children you'll never meet, Myung-soo said to her once, disbelief and gratitude tangled together in his voice. I'm helping the man I love be a good father, Sonia corrected gently. That's not a sacrifice. That's a privilege. She kept a private journal for each of his 3 children, Yeonmak, Seryong, Moojin, recording milestones Myung-soo relayed to her during their calls. Small triumphs and worries she tracked from thousands of miles away with the quiet devotion of a woman who had chosen to love not just a man, but the whole invisible shape of his life, including the parts she was never permitted to touch directly. There were harder years, 2 years when the distance felt unbearable, when Sonia sat alone in a house in Atlanta on Christmas mornings while her husband celebrated a holiday half a world away with children who didn't know she existed. There was one particularly brutal stretch, when Myung-soo's company faced a hostile takeover attempt and he disappeared into crisis meetings for 4 straight months, their calls dwindling to rushed, exhausted minutes at midnight, and Sonia had genuinely wondered, in her darkest moments, whether the life she'd chosen was sustainable at all. I can't keep loving a shadow, she told him once, her voice raw with an exhaustion she rarely allowed herself to show. I love you. But I am so tired of being invisible, Myung-soo. I am so tired of being a secret. I know, he had said, and for once he hadn't tried to argue or reassure her. He had simply let the truth of it sit between them, heavy and unresolved. I don't have a good answer for you. I only have my promise that it won't be like this forever, and I understand if that promise has started to feel thin after all these years. It has, she admitted. But I'm still here. Why? He had asked, genuinely wanting to know. Because loving you, even like this, is still more than I found anywhere else, she said. And because I have to believe, that you will find your way to the truth before it's too late for either of us. He never entirely found his way there. Not by choice, not through courage he finally summoned on his own timeline, but through a heart attack on a boardroom floor that stripped away every careful calculation he'd spent 2 decades constructing and left nothing behind but the truth, arriving all at once, exactly the way he had always feared it might. The days that followed were not easy for Sonia. Myung-soo remained in the hospital, gradually improving under Dr. Han's careful supervision, but still too weak for long conversations, drifting frequently into exhausted sleep. Sonia spent most of her hours in the chair beside his bed, and the rest of her time navigating a family that had not yet decided whether to trust her. Mo Jumja was the most openly hostile. She took to appearing in the ICU corridor at odd hours, ostensibly to check on her brother, though her visits always seemed to coincide with moments when she could corner Sonia alone. "You know what people will say," she told Sonia one afternoon, finding her in the small family lounge down the hall, pouring herself a cup of vending machine coffee she had no real intention of drinking. A Black American woman appears out of nowhere the moment a wealthy Korean man is on his deathbed, claiming to be his secret wife. Do you understand how that sounds to the press? To our investors? People will say you're after his money. They will say far worse than that, and you will have no one to blame but yourself for keeping this secret in the first place. "I didn't keep the secret alone, Mrs. M.O., Sonia said evenly, setting down the coffee cup. "Your brother made that choice as much as I did, for reasons that had far more to do with protecting his children than protecting himself. Convenient that the reasoning always seems to fall back on protecting the children, while you were the one benefiting from a marriage none of us knew existed." "I benefited from loving your brother," Sonia said, her voice steady despite the accusation. "I did not benefit from his money. I have never asked him for a single one in 22 years, and if you check with his attorney, you'll find that to be entirely true." "We'll see," Emo Jumja said coldly and walked away without another word. Yeonmok's hostility was quieter, but no less persistent. He began making inquiries of his own, calling contacts at immigration offices, requesting background checks through the company's private security firm, pulling every thread he could find in an attempt to unravel what he still, privately, believed must be some elaborate deception. "I found nothing," he admitted grudgingly to Siriong one evening, the two of them sitting together in the hospital cafeteria, picking at food neither of them had much appetite for. "No debts. No criminal record. No history of scamming wealthy men. Her foundation is real. It's funded 3 hospitals in East Africa and 2 scholarship programs in Southeast Asia. She's been profiled in actual humanitarian publications for over a decade." "So she's telling the truth," Siriong said quietly. "Or she's very, very good at covering her tracks," Yeonmok said, though even he seemed to hear how thin the accusation sounded now. "Yeonmok." Siriong set down her fork and looked at her brother directly. "When does it become enough?" "The marriage certificate. Professor Kai's testimony. The ring. Her entire life checking out under every investigation you've thrown at her. At what point do you let yourself consider that she might simply be exactly who she says she is?" Yeonmok didn't answer immediately. He stared down at his tray, jaw working, some old resentment surfacing that had nothing to do with Sonia at all. "Do you know what it's like," he said finally, "to spend your whole life thinking you understood your father completely, and then discover in a single night that you understood almost nothing? I have spent 20 years trying to be the son he needed. I studied what he studied. I learned what he valued. I built my entire identity around understanding this man, and it turns out he was living an entire secret life I never once suspected. That's not a small thing to swallow, Siriong. That's not something I can just accept because a marriage certificate looks real." Siriong reached across the table and gripped her brother's hand, a rare gesture between them, both of them typically too guarded for open affection. "I know," she said softly. "I feel it too. But being angry at her isn't going to give us back the years we didn't know. Only Dad can do that. And he's still here to do it, Yeonmok. That has to count for something." Mujin, alone among his siblings, had begun spending time with Sonia directly, hesitant, cautious conversations in the hospital corridor, small questions asked with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. "What was he like?" Mujin asked her one evening, finding her alone in the family lounge, staring out the window at the darkened Seoul skyline. "Back then, when you first met him." Sonia turned, surprised by the question, and something in her face softened. "Sadder than he let anyone see," she said. "Careful in a way that broke my heart a little, honestly. Like he'd learned very young that showing too much of himself was dangerous. It took months before he really laughed around me. A real laugh, I mean. Not the polite one he probably uses in boardrooms." Mujin smiled faintly. "I know that laugh. The real one. He used it with us sometimes when we were kids. Less as we got older." He hesitated. "Did he talk about us? You and him. Did he ever mention what we were like?" "Constantly," Sonia said, and something in her voice cracked with fondness. "He used to call me after your school events and tell me every detail, even the ones that probably weren't that interesting to anyone but a proud father. I know you built a working telescope for a science fair when you were 14 and cried when it didn't win first place. I know Siriong once organized her entire bookshelf by publication date instead of by author, which drove your father slightly insane because he couldn't find anything. I know Yeonmok used to practice his boardroom presentations in the mirror when he was 16 because he wanted to sound exactly like your father someday. Mujin stared at her, something raw and unguarded moving across his face. He told you all of that? He told me everything, Sonia said quietly. For 22 years, you three were the center of every conversation we ever had. I know you better than you could possibly imagine, Mujin, even though this is only the second time we've ever spoken. I've been loving you from a distance since you were 12 years old. Mujin looked away, blinking hard, and when he spoke again his voice was unsteady. That's not what I expected you to say. What did you expect? I don't know, he admitted. Something colder, maybe. Something that would make it easier to keep being angry. I understand if you need to be angry for a while, Sonia said gently. I'm not asking you to forgive 22 years of silence overnight. I'm only asking you to let yourself learn the truth before you decide what to do with it. It was 2 days later that attorney Pyo Sang-guk arrived at the hospital, carrying a leather case that would finally, irrevocably, bring that truth into the light. Attorney Pyo Sang-guk was a small, precise man who had served as the Cha family's legal counsel for nearly 30 years, and he entered the hospital conference room that afternoon with the particular gravity of a man who had been waiting a long time to finally set something down. Mr. Cha instructed me, many years ago, that in the event of a medical emergency severe enough to threaten his life, I was to bring this to his family, he said, setting the leather case on the table and unlatching it carefully. I have honored that instruction today. Inside were 3 sealed envelopes, each yellowed slightly with age, each addressed in Myeong-soo's careful handwriting, one to Yeonmok, one to Siriong, one to Mujin. Beneath them lay a thick folder, and beneath that, a smaller bundle of photographs bound with a faded ribbon. He wrote these when? Yeonmok asked, staring at the envelope bearing his name. Various times over the years, Attorney Pyo said. The most recent was updated 8 months ago. He has been adding to this file since before Mujin was born. Yeonmok's hands were not quite steady as he broke the seal on his envelope. Inside was a letter several pages long, along with a photograph, Myeong-soo, younger, standing beside Sonia in front of what looked like a modest courthouse, both of them smiling in a way none of his children had ever seen captured in a single photograph before. The letter began simply, My son, if you are reading this, then either I have finally found the courage to tell you myself, or something has happened that stole that choice from me before I could. I hope, more than almost anything, that it is the former. Yeonmok read in silence, his siblings doing the same beside him, the room filled with nothing but the soft rustle of paper and the occasional sharp intake of breath. Myeong-soo's letter to his eldest son was an accounting of guilt and love in equal measure, an explanation of the threats his family had once faced from old business rivals who would have used any scandal as a weapon, an apology for every business trip that had truly been a visit to a wife he could not acknowledge, and beneath all of it, a fierce, aching pride in the man Yeonmok had become despite, or perhaps partly because of, a father who had never fully let him in. I watched you become a leader I am in awe of, the letter read, and every time I watched you succeed, I felt the particular pain of a man hiding the person who taught me, more than anyone, what it means to lead with integrity rather than fear. Sonia showed me that strength does not require secrecy. I only wish I had learned that lesson in time to give it to you sooner. Yeonmok set the letter down, his jaw tight, his eyes glassy in a way he clearly fought to control. Beside him, Siriong had opened the thick folder that had been beneath the envelopes. Inside were 22 years of anniversary letters, one for every year of the marriage. Each one a private conversation between 2 people who had loved each other across an ocean and a secret. She read through them slowly, watching her father's private voice unfold in a way she had never once heard him speak aloud, tender, uncertain, deeply romantic in a manner utterly unlike the composed executive she had grown up under. Listen to this one, she said quietly, her voice unsteady, reading aloud from a letter dated 11 years earlier. Sonia, today Sirion graduated at the top of her class, and I stood in the audience so proud I could barely breathe, and the only thing that made the moment feel incomplete was that you were not beside me to see it. I gave her the pen you suggested. She loved it. She will never know it came from you, and that breaks something in me every single time, but I promise you, my love, she carries a piece of you with her regardless. Siriong's voice broke entirely on the last line, and she pressed a hand over her mouth, tears finally falling freely. The pen, she whispered. My graduation pen. I still use it. I use it every single day. Mujin had opened the bundle of photographs and his hands had gone very still. Hundreds of images, Myung-soo and Sonia together across 2 decades, in cities Mujin recognized and cities he didn't, their faces aging gradually together across the years the way only 2 people who had genuinely built a life together could show. And interspersed among them, smaller photographs that made Mujin's chest ache in an entirely different way, pictures of himself as a child, as a teenager, as a young man, clearly given to Sonia by Myung-soo over the years. Kept and treasured by a woman raising an invisible, unacknowledged love for children who had no idea she existed. She has pictures of us, Mujin said quietly, disbelief thick in his voice. From every year. She kept every single one. Sonia, standing quietly near the door where she had remained throughout the reading, watched the 3 siblings absorb 2 decades of a truth she had lived every day, and said nothing, letting them arrive at their own understanding in their own time. It was Siriong who found the journals several days later, tucked at the bottom of the case attorney Pyo had brought, easy to overlook among the letters and photographs. It was Sonia's own handwriting, private entries never meant for anyone else's eyes, and Siriong read them with a growing, humbling awe. One entry, dated 9 years earlier, stopped her cold. A distant cousin of Myung-soo's, a young girl, barely 6 years old, suffering from a rare blood disorder, had needed a bone marrow transplant, and no match had been found within the family. Sonia's entry described, in spare, unemotional prose, her decision to undergo testing anonymously through an international registry after Myung-soo mentioned the family's desperate search during one of their calls. She had matched. She had donated. She had asked that her identity never be disclosed to the family, wanting nothing in return, not even gratitude. Siriong brought the journal to Sonia with trembling hands. This girl, she said. Cha Yuna. She's my second cousin. She's 14 now. Healthy. We always said the transplant was a miracle, an anonymous donor match that saved her life. That was you. I didn't want anyone to know, Sonia said simply. It wasn't about being thanked. Your father told me she might not survive without a match, and I couldn't live with myself if I hadn't tried, family in name or not. Not even Aunt Jumja knew, Siriong whispered. No one knew, Sonia confirmed. It was never meant to be about me. Siriong looked at this woman, this stranger who had, without a single word of acknowledgement or thanks, quietly saved the life of a child she had never legally been permitted to call family, and felt something long-held and defensive finally begin to crack open inside her chest. I'm sorry, Siriong said, her voice barely audible, for what I said to you. For calling you a liar. You were protecting your father, Sonia said gently. I understand that better than almost anyone. The following week, with Myung-soo's condition stable enough for cautious hope, Attorney Pyo gathered the family once more to review the will Myung-soo had updated only months earlier. The corporation, in its entirety, passes to the 3 children in equal shares, with Yeonmak retaining his position as executive vice president and first right of refusal on the chief executive role, pending board approval, Attorney Pyo read, his tone measured and formal. The personal residence in Gangnam is to be transferred to Sonia Jaden, along with the entirety of the Cha Family Charitable Foundation, its assets, and its ongoing operations. Personal journals, correspondence, and photographs are to be divided among all 4 beneficiaries as they see fit. The room absorbed this in silence. He's leaving her the house, Yeonmak said slowly. And the foundation. He built that foundation 12 years ago specifically to give Sonia a formal role in something connected to your family, even if her name could never appear publicly, Attorney Pyo explained. It has quietly funded much of the humanitarian work she does independently. He wanted her to have full control of it, unencumbered, regardless of what happened to him. Sonia, seated at the far end of the table, shook her head slowly. "I don't want it," she said. Every head turned toward her. "The foundation, yes, I'll continue that work, because it matters, because it was built from something real between us. But the house, no. I don't need it, and I don't want any of you thinking, even for a moment, that I came into this family's life looking for property or inheritance." She looked directly at Yeonmak as she spoke. "I didn't come here for money. I came here because I love your father, and because I've spent 22 years hoping I would someday get to stand in a room with his children without secrecy standing between us. That hope is worth more to me than any house in Gangnam." "You're refusing an inheritance worth millions," Yeonmak said, genuine confusion cutting through his usual guardedness. "I have my own money, Yeonmak," Sonia said, not unkindly. "I have run a successful foundation for 30 years. I do not need your father's estate to survive, and I will not take something that might make it harder for this family to eventually trust that I never wanted it in the first place." Attorney Pyo cleared his throat gently. Mr. Cha anticipated this response, actually. He left an additional note, specifically addressing this possibility. He withdrew a final sealed letter and handed it to Sonia. She opened it with visibly unsteady hands. The letter was brief, written in Myung-soo's familiar careful script. "My love, if you are reading this and refusing what I've left you, I am not remotely surprised, and I love you more for it than you know. But please understand, the house was never about money. It was the only home I had where I imagined, every single day, what it might have looked like if you had truly lived there beside me. Let it finally hold that dream, even if I'm not there to share it with you. Please." Sonia pressed the letter against her chest, tears sliding silently down her face, and said nothing for a long moment. "I'll take the house," she said finally, her voice thick. "For him. Not for me." Mo Jumja, who had remained largely silent throughout the reading, studied Sonia with an expression that had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from suspicion toward something more complicated. "You truly didn't know about any of this," she said. "The house. The foundation." "I knew he was making arrangements," Sonia admitted. "I didn't know the specifics. I never asked. I told him repeatedly, over the years, that I didn't want to be a name in his will, I wanted to be a name in his life, and that was never something a lawyer could grant me." Mo Jumja said nothing further, but something in her posture had softened, the rigid defensiveness of the past several days giving way, slowly, to something closer to reluctant respect. 3 days later, Myung-soo was well enough to sit up in bed, still frail but alert, his voice returning gradually to something resembling its former strength. Sonia was at his side when he asked, quietly, for his children to be brought in. They filed in one by one, Yeonmak first, then Siriang, then Mujin, and stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed, none of them entirely certain how to begin a conversation that had been 22 years in the making. "I owe all of you an apology," Myung-soo said, his voice weak but clear, his eyes moving from one child to the next. "Not a small one. Not one I can offer in a single sentence and consider settled. I built a wall around the truth of my life because I was afraid of what it might cost you, afraid of what it might cost the company, afraid, if I'm honest, of what it might mean for me to finally be seen completely by the people whose opinions mattered to me most. I told myself I was protecting you, and some of that was true, but some of it was cowardice, and I have carried that shame for a very long time." "Dad," Yeonmak started, but Myung-soo lifted a trembling hand to stop him. "Let me finish. Please." He took a slow breath. "Sonia is my wife. She has been my wife for 22 years, and she has loved all 3 of you more faithfully, from a greater distance, than I ever gave her credit for deserving. Every kindness you thought came from me alone, the pen, the telescope, 100 small gifts and gestures across your childhoods, half of those came from a woman none of you had ever met, who chose, every single time, to put your happiness before her own recognition. I don't expect you to understand this overnight. I don't expect forgiveness on any particular timeline. I only ask that you let yourselves see her clearly, the way I finally let myself see her clearly 23 years ago in Singapore." Siriang was crying openly now, and even Yeonmak's composure had finally, visibly cracked. "Why didn't you just tell us?" Mujin asked, his voice raw. "Even after we were grown. Even after the danger you talk about wasn't really a danger anymore. Why let it go on so long? Myung-soo closed his eyes briefly, old grief moving across his face. Because the longer a secret lives, the heavier it becomes to finally set down, he admitted. Every year that passed, I told myself next year, when things are more stable, when the timing is better. And there is never a perfect time to tell the people you love that you've been hiding half of your heart from them. I kept waiting for courage that I should have found decades ago. I am sorry it took a heart attack to finally force my hand. That is my greatest regret, and I will spend whatever time I have left trying to make it right. Yeonmak stepped forward slowly, his eyes fixed on his father, and for the first time since the collapse in the boardroom, something in his rigid posture finally gave way. I'm still angry, he said quietly. I think I'll be angry for a while yet. But I don't want to lose more time being angry than I have to. Not after almost losing you completely. That's more than I deserve, Myung-soo said, his voice breaking. Probably, Yeonmak agreed, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile flickered across his exhausted face. But I'm still your son. It was the first time in days that anyone in the room had managed to laugh, even briefly, even through tears. For the first time in 22 years, the six of them sat together around Myung-soo's hospital bed. Sonia, Yeonmak, Siriong, Mujin, and eventually even Mo Jumja, who arrived quietly and took a chair near the window without a word of protest. The conversation was halting at first, full of long pauses and careful sentences, the natural awkwardness of people who had spent their entire relationship as strangers now trying to become something else entirely. Tell me about the telescope, Mujin said eventually, looking at Sonia with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. You said you picked it out. How did you even know what model I wanted? Your father described it to me over the phone for 20 minutes, Sonia said, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. He got the specifications slightly wrong twice and had to call me back to correct himself. I think he was more excited about that telescope than you were. Mujin laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and beside him, Myung-soo managed a weak, fond smile of his own. I was excited, he admitted. You loved space so much as a boy. I wanted to give you the whole sky if I could have managed it. You gave me a 12-inch reflector telescope, Mujin said. That was pretty close. Siriong, sitting on the other side of the bed, found herself studying Sonia's face, the quiet patience there, the obvious exhaustion of days spent in uncomfortable hospital chairs. The way she still reached instinctively to smooth the blanket over Myung-soo's legs whenever it slipped. Can I ask you something? Siriong said. All those years. Did you ever consider leaving? Finding someone who could actually be with you, publicly, without any of this? Sonia considered the question seriously before answering. Every difficult year, I considered it, she said honestly. There were nights I sat alone in my house in Atlanta and wondered if I was wasting my life loving a man I couldn't fully have. But then I would think about the person I fell in love with in Singapore, his kindness, his integrity, the way he listened like every word mattered. And I understood that even a partial version of that love was still more meaningful than anything else I had encountered. I never wanted anyone else. I only ever wanted more of him. That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard, Yeonmak said quietly, or the saddest. Perhaps both, Sonia said. Most true love stories are. Mo Jumja, who had remained silent through most of the conversation, finally spoke from her chair by the window, her voice unusually subdued. I owe you an apology as well, she said, looking at Sonia directly. I said cruel things to you. I assumed the worst, because it was easier than confronting how little I actually knew about my own brother's life. That was my failing, not yours. Thank you, Sonia said simply, without any trace of triumph or vindication in her voice, only quiet grace. I was protecting this family the only way I knew how, Mo Jumja continued, her weathered hands tightening around the head of her cane. Our father built this empire from nothing, and I watched him nearly lose it twice to scandal and betrayal. I learned very young that outsiders were dangerous, that loyalty had to be fought for and guarded fiercely. I never learned how to recognize when an outsider might actually be exactly what this family needed. I'm an old woman set in old ways. I hope you can forgive that, even if it takes time. I have nothing but time now, Sonia said gently. I intend to spend quite a lot of it here, if your family will have me. Myung-soo, Watching this exchange from his pillow, felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight for over 2 decades, not his heart, which the doctors continued to monitor carefully, but something older and more stubborn. A knot of fear and secrecy he had carried since long before any of his children were born. "I never imagined I would see this," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "All of you in one room together. I spent so many years afraid of exactly this moment, and now that it has finally arrived, I cannot understand what I was so frightened of." "You are frightened of losing us," Siriong said softly. "That's not cowardice, Dad. That's just love with too much fear attached to it." "Perhaps," Myongsu said. "I only wish I had trusted that love could survive the truth far sooner than I did." The days that followed brought slow, steady improvement, and for 2 weeks it seemed as though Myongsu might make a full recovery, strength returning gradually to his voice, color returning to his face. The family settling into an increasingly comfortable rhythm of visits and conversations that grew easier with each passing day. But cardiac damage, Dr. Han had warned them from the beginning, was unpredictable in its long-term consequences, and on a quiet Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the initial collapse, Myongsu's heart began, gently and without drama, to fail once more. "It's not the same emergency as before," Dr. Han explained to the family, gathered once again in the same consultation room where they had first learned how serious his condition truly was. "This is different. His heart sustained significant damage in the initial attack, and despite our best efforts, that damage has proven more extensive than we initially hoped. I don't believe there's anything further medically we can do beyond making him comfortable." "How long?" Sonia asked, her voice steady despite the devastation plainly visible in her eyes. "Days, most likely," Dr. Han said gently. "Perhaps a week, if he's strong." "I'm very sorry." The family absorbed this news in the particular silence that follows the confirmation of something everyone had quietly feared but not yet allowed themselves to say aloud. Sonia was the first to move, walking directly back toward Myongsu's room without hesitation, and the 3 siblings followed close behind her, no longer divided by suspicion or old resentments, but united now in the shared, urgent understanding that whatever time remained needed to be spent well. Myongsu was awake and lucid when they entered, though visibly weaker than he had been even the day before, his breathing more labored, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for Sonia's. "I heard," he said quietly, before anyone could find the words to tell him. "Dr. Han came by earlier. I made him tell me plainly. I've had enough careful phrasing in my life." "Dad," Mujin's voice cracked. "Don't," Myongsu said gently, though his eyes were kind. "Don't grieve for me yet. Sit with me instead. All of you. I have things I still need to say, and I find I no longer have the patience to wait for perfect timing." They gathered close around the bed, Sonia on one side, holding his hand, the 3 siblings arranged around the other, Emo Jumja settling quietly into the chair by the window once more. "Yeonmak," Myongsu said, turning his head slightly to look at his eldest son. "You will lead this company well. Better than I did, I think, because you will not need to carry the same weight of secrecy I carried. Lead with the strength I know is in you, but let it be tempered with the kindness I only fully learned from your mother." He paused. "From Sonia. Learned that lesson faster than I did." "I will," Yeonmak said, his voice unsteady. "Siriong." Myongsu's gaze shifted. "You have always longed for my approval, and I am ashamed it took this illness for me to say plainly what I should have told you your whole life. You have always had it. Every accomplishment, every quiet act of integrity, I have watched with more pride than I ever knew how to express. Please don't spend the rest of your life seeking approval that was always yours." Siriong pressed a hand to her mouth, unable to speak, nodding through her tears. "Mujin." Myongsu's voice softened further, exhaustion visibly pulling at him now. "You have your mother's kindness. Don't ever let this family or this business talk you out of it. It is not weakness. It is the rarest strength any of you possess." Mujin gripped his father's other hand, unable to say anything at all. Finally, Myongsu turned to Sonia, and something in his expression shifted into a tenderness that made the room feel, briefly, as though it held only the 2 of them. "I am so sorry," he whispered, "for every year I made you wait. For every birthday you spent alone. For every ounce of pride I let stand between the truth and the people who needed to hear it. You deserved so much more than the life I was brave enough to give you. You gave me exactly the life I chose, Sonia said, her voice breaking despite her effort to remain steady. I chose you, Myung-soo. Every year, every difficult stretch, every secret, I chose you again and again, and I would choose you every single time, because loving you, even imperfectly, was still the greatest privilege of my life. I love you, he said. I have loved you since a rainy night in Singapore, and I will love you beyond whatever comes after this. I love you too, Sonia said, pressing his hand to her lips. Always. The room fell into a kind of hushed, sacred quiet, not the tense silence of the early days, but something gentler, something that finally felt like peace after 2 decades of careful, guarded distance. Myung-soo's breathing grew slower over the following hours, his consciousness drifting in and out, though he seemed, each time he woke, comforted simply by the sight of his family gathered around him, no longer divided. He passed away just after midnight, Sonia's hand in his 3 children close beside the bed, the monitors finally falling silent in the particular, terrible stillness that follows a life's end. There was no dramatic final gasp, no cinematic last words, only a quiet exhale, and then nothing, and the slow, devastating realization among everyone present that he was truly gone. Sonia did not sob loudly. She simply bowed her head over his hand and wept silently, 22 years of stolen weekends and midnight phone calls and careful, hidden love finally arriving at their end. Seryong cried openly, her head resting against her brother Moojin's shoulder. Yeonmak stood very still, tears sliding down a face that had rarely allowed itself such open grief, his hand resting gently on his father's shoulder. There were no arguments in that hospital room that night. No talk of inheritance, no old resentments resurfacing. Only tears and grief and the particular, hard-won closeness of a family that had finally, in the end, come to understand each other completely. 3 weeks after the funeral arrangements had been quietly settled, Attorney Pyo gathered the family once more, Sonia, Yeonmak, Seryong, Moojin, and Mo Jumja, in the same conference room where the will had first been read. Though the atmosphere this time was entirely different, softened by shared grief rather than sharpened by suspicion. Mr. Cha recorded a final message 8 months ago, Attorney Pyo explained, setting a laptop on the table. He asked that it be played only after his passing, and only once the entire family was gathered together. I believe now is the appropriate time. The screen flickered to life, and Myung-soo appeared, seated in what looked like his study at home, dressed casually, his expression calm and unhurried in a way none of them had often seen from him in life. If you are watching this, he began, then I am gone, and you have somehow all found your way into the same room, which means Sonia finally met all of you, and I imagine there was a great deal of difficulty getting there. I am sorry I was not able to walk you through that difficulty myself, in the gentler way I always intended. He paused, gathering himself. I spent my whole life believing that strength meant control, controlling information, controlling outcomes, controlling exactly how much of myself the world was permitted to see. It took a woman braver than I ever managed to be to show me that real strength is the opposite of that. Real strength is allowing yourself to be fully known and trusting that the people who love you will not abandon you for the truth. His eyes, even through the recording, seemed to find each of them individually. Yeonmak, Seryong, Moojin, I know this has been a painful education and your father truly was. I know some of you may still be working through anger, and that is a fair and reasonable response to 2 decades of silence. I do not ask you to set that anger aside quickly. I only ask that beneath it, you hold on to this truth. I loved your mother, and I love Sonia, and loving one never diminished the other. Love, real love, does not divide when it multiplies. It only grows. He leaned forward slightly, his voice growing more urgent. If you truly love me, and I believe, in your own complicated ways, that you do, then love the woman who loved all of you without ever asking for anything in return. She built a private altar to your childhoods out of photographs and stories I brought her from thousands of miles away, and she never once demanded recognition for it. She saved a member of this family's life and asked that no one ever know. She held my hand through decades of my own cowardice and never once let go. If you want to honor my memory, honor her. Not because I am asking it as my dying wish, but because she has earned it 1,000 times over on her own merit. The recording paused briefly, Myung-soo's composure visibly wavering before he continued. To my sister, Junja, thank you for protecting this family your whole life, even when your methods were harder than they needed to be. I know love from you looks like vigilance. I hope someday it can also look like welcome. He turned finally, his expression softening into something almost boyish, decades of careful control falling away entirely. And Sonia, my love, I am sorry it took so long. I am sorry you spent 22 years being my greatest secret instead of my proudest declaration. If there is any mercy left for me to ask for, it is this, that the years remaining to you are lived in the open, surrounded by the family you always deserve to call your own, without a single shadow of secrecy left standing between you and the world. You gave me the truest love of my life. I only wish I had been brave enough to give you the same in return, in full daylight, while I still had the chance. The recording ended. The room remained silent for a long moment, everyone absorbing the weight of a man's final, unguarded words. Sonia wiped her eyes and managed a small, trembling smile. He always did save his best speeches for when I couldn't respond, she said, and the small joke broke the tension just enough to allow a shared, watery laugh among the family. The funeral was held 2 weeks later, and by then, word of Sonia's existence had inevitably reached the press, a scandal, everyone assumed, ready to be devoured by tabloids eager for exactly the kind of story that had haunted Myung-soo's fears for over 2 decades. Reporters gathered outside the funeral hall, cameras poised, expecting confrontation, denial, perhaps even a dramatic legal battle over inheritance playing out in public view. Instead, Yeonmak walked to the small podium at the front of the memorial service, dressed in formal black, his composure entirely intact despite the enormous crowd of employees, business associates, and press gathered to witness his father's final farewell. Many of you have heard rumors over the past several weeks, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed room. About a woman who arrived at my father's hospital bedside claiming a relationship none of us knew existed. I understand the speculation. I understand, better than most of you, how strange and sudden this truth must appear from the outside. He paused, glancing toward Sonia, seated in the front row beside Seryong and Mujin, her expression composed despite the enormous public scrutiny now fixed upon her. This is my father's wife, Yeonmak said clearly, without hesitation. Sonia Jaden Cha. They were married 22 years ago, quietly, out of fear for what the truth might cost this family. My father spent 2 decades protecting us from a scandal that never needed to exist in the first place, because the truth was never scandalous at all. The truth was simply love, patient, faithful, and far braver than any of us understood until it was almost too late to learn it. A murmur moved through the crowd, cameras clicking rapidly, but Yeonmak did not falter. From today, she is not a secret. She is not a rumor. She is our family's mother, in every sense that matters, and I would ask that anyone who respected my father extend that same respect to the woman he loved for over 2 decades in silence, and whom we now honor openly, exactly as he asked us to in his final wishes. He stepped back from the podium, and Sonia rose slowly from her seat, crossing the room to stand beside him, her hand finding his in a gesture of solidarity that the assembled press captured in dozens of photographs that would run in newspapers the following morning, not as scandal, but as something closer to grace. The crowd, rather than erupting into the chaos everyone had braced for, settled instead into a hushed, moved silence, and somewhere near the back of the room, someone began to quietly applaud, the sound spreading gradually until the entire hall had joined in a gesture that felt less like ceremony and more like collective release. The months that followed brought a slow, steady transformation to the Cha family. The kind that could not have happened overnight, but unfolded gradually, in small gestures and quiet conversations that gathered weight over time. Yeonmak, now formally installed as chief executive, found himself governing the company with a different philosophy than the one he had inherited from his father's early years, less concerned with controlling every variable, more willing to admit uncertainty to his board, more transparent with employees about the challenges the company faced. He began, gradually, calling Sonia for advice, not about business, which she had little interest in, but about the particular loneliness of leadership, the weight of decisions made in isolation, the value of allowing himself to be known rather than merely respected. Your father used to ask me the same questions, Sonia told him once, several months after the funeral, the two of them sharing coffee in the Gangnam house that had once been Myung-soo's quiet refuge and was now, slowly, becoming a genuine home. He always thought strength meant never showing doubt. It took him most of his life to understand that doubt shared honestly builds more trust than confidence performed constantly. I'm trying to learn that faster than he did, Yeonmak admitted. You're already doing better than you think, Sonia said, and meant it. Siriang, for her part, found herself drawn increasingly close to Sonia over the following months, the two women developing a relationship that neither of them had expected but both had quietly hoped for. Siriang began visiting the Gangnam house on weekends, initially with careful, polite conversation and gradually with the easy comfort of women who had grown genuinely fond of one another. I used to think strength meant being like Dad, Siriang confessed one evening, curled into the corner of Sonia's sofa with a cup of tea warming her hands. Composed. Controlled. Never showing what you actually felt. I spent my whole life trying to be that, and it made me so lonely, and I never understood why until I watched you grieve him so openly at the funeral and realized that kind of honesty takes far more courage than anything I've ever managed. You don't have to choose between strength and honesty, Sonia said gently. The best version of both requires you to hold them together. Mujin, already the sibling most drawn to Sonia from the beginning, formally joined the Cha Family Charitable Foundation's board within the year, throwing himself into humanitarian work with the same quiet enthusiasm his father had once shown. Funding scholarship programs and medical initiatives across Southeast Asia and East Africa with Sonia's guidance and mentorship. I think I finally understand what he loved about this work, Mujin told her during one of their frequent planning meetings, reviewing applications for a new scholarship cohort. It's not really about the money. It's about seeing someone's life change because you refuse to look away from their need. Your father understood that too, eventually, Sonia said. He just needed someone to show him first. Mo Jumja's transformation was the slowest and the most private, but no less genuine for its quiet pace. She began appearing at the Gangnam house occasionally, ostensibly to discuss old family matters, though the visits increasingly became simple conversations over tea. Two women from very different worlds gradually finding common ground in shared grief and grudging mutual respect. I was wrong about you, Mo Jumja told Sonia directly, nearly 6 months after the funeral, sitting stiffly in the same sitting room where she had once accused Sonia of chasing wealth. I judged you before I understood you, because judgment was easier than admitting how little I actually knew about my own brother's heart. I am sorry, Sonia. Truly. Thank you, Sonia said simply. I forgave you the day you said it the first time. I understood, even then, that you were only trying to protect what you loved. That's more grace than I deserve, Mo Jumja admitted. Perhaps, Sonia said, echoing words Myung-soo himself had once spoken. But I've found grace tends to matter most exactly when it isn't deserved. 1 year after Myung-soo's passing, the family gathered once more, not in a hospital corridor, not in a somber conference room, but at the opening ceremony of the Cha Jaden Foundation, a formal expansion of the charitable work Sonia and Myung-soo had quietly built together across 2 decades, now brought fully into the light and carried forward by the family Myung-soo had once been so afraid to unite. The Foundation's mission expanded now with the full resources and involvement of all 3 siblings, focused on 4 pillars close to both Myung-soo's and Sonia's hearts: scholarships for underprivileged students across Asia and Africa, international medical assistance programs modeled on the hospitals Sonia had spent her career building, cultural exchange programs specifically designed to connect Korea and the United States in the way that had once brought 2 strangers together in a rain-soaked conference hall in Singapore, and dedicated support services for widows and elderly patients navigating illness without adequate family support. At the entrance to the Foundation's new headquarters stood a simple bronze plaque, its words chosen carefully by the family together, drawn from letters Myung-soo had written across 22 years of hidden love. Love should never be hidden, the plaque read. But even hidden love can leave the brightest legacy. Sonia stood before the plaque on the morning of the opening ceremony, dressed simply. Her 3 stepchildren gathered beside her, not as strangers navigating an awkward inheritance, not as rivals suspicious of an outsider's intentions, but as family, standing together in a way that would have seemed impossible to any of them barely a year earlier. "He would be so proud of this," Siriong said quietly, studying the plaque, her hand resting lightly on Sonia's shoulder. "He would be proud of all of you," Sonia said, her eyes glistening but her voice steady. "This isn't really my legacy or even his. It's yours now. What you build from here, that's what will carry him forward." Yeonmak looked out at the gathered crowd, employees and community members and reporters who had, over the past year, come to understand this family's story not as scandal, but as something rarer and more valuable, proof that even the deepest secrets, when finally met with honesty and grace, could transform into something worth celebrating rather than hiding. To love without hiding, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. That's what he wanted for us. I think we're finally learning how. Mujin smiled, slipping an arm around Sonia's shoulders in a gesture that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Took us long enough. Some of the most important things do, Sonia said, leaning into the embrace, surrounded finally, completely, by the family she had loved faithfully from a distance for over 2 decades, and who now, at long last, loved her openly in return. The ceremony continued into the afternoon, filled with speeches and stories and the particular warmth of a family that had survived devastating secrecy and emerged, against every reasonable expectation, closer and more honest than they had ever been. Somewhere in the crowd, Kai Do-hyun watched with quiet satisfaction, remembering a rainy night in Singapore decades earlier when he had first met the woman who would one day become the truest test and ultimately the greatest gift his oldest friend's family would ever face. Love, truth, and forgiveness stronger, in the end, than prejudice, secrecy, or pride. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing which part touched you most, and subscribe for more stories just like this one. Your support means everything, and it helps bring more stories like Myung-soo and Sonia's to life. Thank you for watching until the very end.